I just want to start very briefly how you've got to this point, because there's something quite interesting in the contrast between you. So first of all, Nick, let me turn to you. Tell us why it is the European Union is so important to you and why it is that you are campaigning so hard. It's not in terms of the substantive issues, your personal story. Why is it you've ended up playing a leading role?
I freely admit I'm sort of genetically predisposed, I suppose, to be a pro-European. I mean, I can't be anything else with a Dutch mum, a half-Russian dad, married to a Spaniard. And, I'm a sort of genetic United Nations on stilts sort of thing. And so, in that sense, it was always just part of my upbringing, this idea that countries do things together and do bad things to each other as well. That was just sort of part of my upbringing. But I think, for me, the biggest thing of all, and perhaps, dare I say it, for my generation, was a sort of feeling that the biggest force which affects us, and I think will do for the foreseeable future, is this great big churning, disruptive, occasionally creative, occasionally rather a challenging thing called globalization in all its facets. Climate change is a form of globalization. International crime is a form of globalization, as are the more traditional understandings of global finance and so on. And since I am growing up in an era of globalization, I've always thought to myself, whether you like it or not, if you want to exercise control over your own fate in an era of globalization, you can only do so by seeking to control things with others, because you gain greater control by doing things with your European kith and kin in an era of global. So I've always regarded the European Union, much though, of course, its origins were all about the coal and steel community and the post-war settlement after the Second World War and Franco-German reconciliation. I still view, flawed though it undoubtedly is, the European Union as one of the world's most sophisticated responses to globalization, in which nation states voluntarily recognize that they deal with globalization more successfully, both its opportunities and threats, by working in concert with each other.
Brilliantly, you've taken a personal question and you've steered it towards a substantive point, but I would expect no less of you. Andrea Leadsom is Conservative MP for South Northamptonshire, Minister of State for Energy and Climate Change. Now, Andrea, what's interesting about you is that Nick's got European Union kind of written through him. You've actually changed your view over recent years. So tell us about that journey.
Yeah, so just to begin with, I would say in contrast to Nick, I was raised very much as the world doesn't owe you a living, you make your own way in life. Raised partly by my mum as a single mum from a very young age in quite some poverty. Went to a girls' grammar school. My parents had a furniture shop. They did very well out of it. And it was very much you make your own way in life, enormously patriotic and democratic and looking out for people who can't look out for themselves, but very much a patriot. So my view of the EU is very transactional. I'm a great believer in free enterprise and giving people a hand up. So I thought, yep, the EU, if it can be reformed, can be good for trade, the cooperation can be good. So in my first parliament, which was 2010 to 2015, I spent 3 years setting up and running something called the Fresh Start project. As you see, sunlit uplands. And the project was about remaining in a fundamentally reformed EU. And the Fresh Start project was lifting up the bonnet, diving into the engine, seeing how does the EU impact on the UK, and how could it be reformed so that it would work much better, not just for the UK, but for the EU itself. And so we came up with a huge doorstop, great for a cure for insomnia, of ideas and research. We took so many hundreds of hours of hearings, and ultimately we distilled it into a mandate for reform. And so for me, the road to Damascus moment was actually the day the Prime Minister came back with his renegotiation. And it seemed to me that with all the effort he put in, with the certainty of a UK referendum behind his renegotiation efforts, that there was no chance that the EU could reform. Now, I've had 25 years in finance, 4 years on the Treasury Committee and a year as City Minister before Energy Minister. So what my economic experience tells me is that in order for the EU to succeed now, if it won't reform, it either has to become a United States of Europe or it has to fail. Now, that can take a very long time, but in the meantime, it creates misery. So for me, it was a very recent decision that actually, if reform is impossible, we have to leave, because the way things are going in the European Union, it's a disaster for the United Kingdom, and not only that, but for the rest of Europe too.
Very good. You followed Nick's lead, segueing from your personal motives to a substantive argument. Now, we've got 3 issues to look at, and just to remind you, in each issue I'm going to allow Nick and Andrea 2 minutes, no more than 3, to make their positive case on these points. I'll ask them a couple of questions. If there's time, I'll bring in a couple of points from you. So we're going to start with that kind of Life of Brian question. What has the EU ever done for us? So, Nick, starting with you, your 2 no more than 3 minutes on what the European Union has done for us so far starts now.
I think it's given us safety in numbers. I can't think of a significant challenge facing us today, or indeed that of my kids' generation or future generations, that doesn't require in one shape or form a collective European response. I've alluded to some of them already. The existential threat of climate change clearly can't be dealt with by the nation state on its own, even a significant one as the United Kingdom. The tentacles of cross-border crime now reaches into every single community in our country. You can't deal with that on your own. You can't go to toe, as I used to. I worked as a previous incarnation as an international trade negotiator. I know these trade negotiators from Russia and China and America very well. They're hard-nosed people. They're not going to react with sentiments towards the United Kingdom. It's a hard-nosed business. You have the clout, the collective clout, of going toe-to-toe with them through the European Union, which you wouldn't have on your own. So it's safety in numbers. I think you gain, oddly enough, more real sovereignty in a globalised world by doing things in concert with others. And here's the thing. If the European Union didn't exist, I suspect our crowded continent, with all these little countries jostling together, given the uncertainties of the world as they are, would probably end up inventing something pretty similar to it. I'm not pessimistic about the European Union. There are profound imbalances in the Eurozone, which must be, in my view, will be resolved. But I think if you look at what it's done in its short life, if you look at what it's done while we've been a member of it for 41 years, it's been a remarkable experiment, and a largely successful one, in creating economies of scale, the world's largest borderless marketplace, and collective responses to challenges which are by definition collective in nature. If anything, the great thing which is lacking is not too much Europe, but is too little collective action these days. Look at this refugee crisis, a classic example of something which actually logically all of Europe should respond to collectively in a coherent and humane way. This beggar thy neighbour selfishness, which has afflicted all the debate across the European Union, is actually making us, far from the sum of our parts, is making us weaker because everybody is seeking to play past the parcel. So that's, in my view, in a nutshell, what the European Union, flawed, as I said it before, undoubtedly is, provides us and will continue to provide us with, is safety in numbers.
Very good. Andrea, what's your view of what the European Union has done so far for the UK?
So I think that Nick makes my point for me. He's making a very good case for a country called Europe. Now, if we were a country called Europe, then all of the issues that Nick sort of talks about as the weaknesses would be solved. You know, a country has first duty is the security of its people. So you don't have artificial barbed wire being put up between Denmark and Sweden as we do today. But in a very specific answer to the question, in the early days, the European Union was, of course, 2 different things. To those who wanted it to be, it was a means to prevent wars in Europe. And to the others who wanted it to be, it was a free trade deal. And it was those 2 things, and you heard what you wanted to hear. And those who voted in 1975 in the UK, some think they got what they bargained for, others think they didn't. And so it was actually sold on a false premise. But what has it done for the UK now? Well, it has, according to the Bank of England, uncontrollable immigration has suppressed wages for the lower earners. And what we know is that the Eurozone has created 52% youth unemployment in Greece. We know it's created more than 52% unemployment of young people in Spain, 38% in Italy, and 45% in Portugal. We know that it's created this agony of barbed wire fences being re-erected. We know that Germany's intervention has helped to cause a migration crisis of gargantuan proportions, where people, innocent people, are being trafficked on a promise that can't be fulfilled and are going to their deaths. So when you ask, what has Europe done for us, for the United Kingdom? Well, our exports to the United Kingdom have flatlined for 10 years and been dropping for the last 3. What we know is that it costs us, we're the second largest contributor, and it costs us in gross terms £350 million a week. We can discuss that.
Come on, folks. You know the rules.
Let me say.
No, let's not get into that now. We'll get into that in a minute. I know all about the 350 million issue, but let's carry on the case that you're making.
So that you'll just cut me off then. Okay.
No.
So £10 billion a year net is money that gets paid over to the EU that we never see any change from. £10 billion a year net, at a time when we know austerity cuts in the UK have been very painful, at a time when we know the NHS desperately needs investment, at a time where we desperately need more social housing to be built, and so on. So there are all sorts of priorities that £10 billion a year net that goes into the European Union that we see no change from could be used for.
Andrew, I'm only cutting you off because we're going to get to this question, what will happen if we stay or if we leave later. Let me just ask you one further question in this section, then maybe see if the questions from the floor. Andrew, if I was to press you on what the single biggest achievement of the European Union up to now has been, it can't all be bleak. So what is the one thing that actually you think it has delivered and it should be recognised for?
I can only go back in history because I genuinely don't see anything good in recent years.
Not the single market?
No, because you see, the single market we'll come on to that, I'm sure, but the single market for me, as an economist with 25 years in finance, is a complete misnomer. Okay. There's a misunderstanding about what the single market is.
So nothing really...
So it did create that framework for peace in Europe, but now I feel NATO is being undermined, and that is the clear intention. And it must be so, because you have to create a United States of Europe. It has to have its own army. It has to have its own preeminent responsibility for security of its own borders and so on. So, I genuinely cannot see in the last 10 to 20 years good that's come out of the EU. But having said that, I love Europe. I speak fluent French. I absolutely love going to Europe. It's not Europe, it's the European Union, it's the institutions that have gone so badly wrong.
And Nick, let me do the same thing for you in the sense of asking you, what is the single biggest mistake you think the European Union has made so far?
I think without a doubt the tensions between the northern creditor nations within the single currency Eurozone and the very bleak economic and social conditions in the debtor southern nations is a huge tension, which can be traced back, in effect, to a botched launch of the single currency. I mean, bluntly, a number of countries, Greece amongst them, should not have been allowed into the single currency in the first place. Their economy simply couldn't withstand it, let alone a bit of jiggery-pokery in terms of how they accounted for their budget. So I think the economic and social imbalances between the creditor north, debtor south of the Eurozone is a very profound one, and it will need to be resolved. And it will need to be resolved not, in my view, by some sort of lurch to a sort of United States, one nation. No, there's some quite specific things that need to be done. You need to somehow, to resolve that imbalance, you need to somehow either mutualise or share debt or transport money, in effect, from the sort of surplus countries to the debtor countries more effectively than they do at the moment. But all of that can, in my view, will take place in the Eurozone, regardless, bluntly, of whether we're in the European Union or not. And again, whether we're in the European Union or not, we should wish them well in sorting out those tensions, because it is by far, and it will remain by far, the largest export market. If you look at the journey of European integration, it's never been an even one. It's almost always been propelled by problems and imbalances. So the oil crisis in the early 70s, when Britain, of course, was going with a begging bowl to the IMF, was the origins for a lot of the thinking that led to a Brit, Lord Cockfield, many years later, to come up with a single European Act, the Single Market rather, and the Single European Act then adopted with gusto by Margaret Thatcher, because there was a feeling that the economic ills in the 1970s could be, and I believe were in some ways, addressed by creating a new borderless marketplace, the likes of which had never been created before. So you get this uneven. It's not a sort of linear. It's not like it's not a perfect blueprint. And I think the imbalances of the Eurozone will lead to solutions, which I don't personally think are a menace or a threat to the United Kingdom. And I think they can happen while we're still comfortably in the European club, enjoying access to the single market and so on, but not being part of the single currency. But that, without a doubt, is the biggest problem it faces right now. Absolutely.
And then, Andrea, and I will open it up then, is just respond to this point that Nick's made, that in the globalised world, you have to share sovereignty if nations work together. And then that is always messy and it always involves making compromises. Do you accept the principle that Britain has to share sovereignty in one way or another, even if it isn't through the European Union?
No, I don't believe we have to share sovereignty. I think to sort of say, well, you know, we're part of NATO, we're part of the World Trade Organization, and those are the same as the EU, is to fundamentally misunderstand the role and purpose of the EU. I mean, in other organizations, we are absolutely not overruled by a supranational court that enforces things on us and then fines us and so on and so on. It's a very, very different type of, and it's not a sharing of sovereignty. Treaties are not by definition a sharing of sovereignty, whereas the European Union absolutely is undermining our sovereignty in the United Kingdom.
Very briefly.
I know Andrea and I are not supposed to talk to each other, much though I'd like to.
No, you can talk to each other. I just want to attack each other.
But I mean, just as someone who, as I said before, worked in a sort of technocratic capacity many years ago in one area where sovereignty has been pooled well beyond the European Union trade, I mean, the WTO has in effect a court. It can impose judgments on us as a signatory of the WTO. It can impose penalties on us. In other words, we have sacrificed, as of all the, whatever it is, 124 members of the WTO, we've all sacrificed a little bit of sovereignty because we all collectively and voluntarily, as sovereign nations, believe that in doing so we create rules of the game that might, whilst they might constrain our liberty, the balance of benefits is beneficial, is positive, because it means that you can't have this kind of race to the bottom or this kind of might is right law of the jungle that otherwise prevails in international trade relations. So the WTO is actually a very good example, of course not on the scale of the European Union. The European Union is far more sophisticated form of pooled sovereignty. The principle is identical. It's you give up untrammeled sovereignty, you accept the jurisdiction of a court, you accept that penalties will be imposed upon you even if you don't like it, but you do so because in return you think you gain something that you otherwise wouldn't get.
Okay. Any questions, actual questions, not rhetorical points or anything else that anybody wants to ask at this stage? We'll move into the next section. You don't need to if you don't want to.
Well, I have.
Yes.
I don't understand how you can say back in 1975 the public were misled. 2 nights ago, the BBC spent the evening, 75 not out, looking at the referendum campaign, and they had a far higher level of debate, not including today's, a far higher level of debate in 75 than now, and all these principles were discussed. There was the idea of losing sovereignty or pooling sovereignty and so on. It was not, we weren't sold a blank cheque, as far as I can see, and I think that seems to be a rewriting of history.
Okay.
So,
very briefly.
Well, you'll want me to answer the
I
question.
will.
So actually, I wasn't saying they were misled. What I was saying is people saw what they wanted to see. So some people saw in it a free trade area, other people saw in it a means of avoiding wars. I wasn't saying they were deliberately wool pulled over their eyes or anything like that, just that it is the fact that different people saw different intentions from the European Union back when we joined.
Good. Okay, let's move now to... very briefly.
Question for Andrea Leadsom. Thank you very much, Matthew. If the leadership of the Leave campaign were in charge of the European Union, could it be got right?
It's a good question, that.
So, yeah, it is. I prefer the second half of the question because I have huge regard for our Prime Minister, and I think if I even go where you're trying to take me, then that I would be sort of choosing this person over that person.
No. I think the point of the question is, if the European Union was run by people who shared your broad views of how to do things, free markets, minimising regulation, whatever, it was run as that kind.
So is it reformable? Absolutely. So without answering the characters in the Leave campaign, that was exactly what this work was designed to do. Literally, I mean, I commend it to all the insomniacs. So you're not opposed to the EU in principle, you're opposed to EU in practice? Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
It's gone badly wrong,
Fine.
as I think I explained at the start, yes.
Great, that's very helpful. Okay, let's turn to our next section, which is looking at what would happen if we left. So, Andrew, your 2 to 3 minutes. The consequences of Brexit.
Okay, so obviously I come from a very big financial background, running financial businesses, so I focus on the economy. So what would happen if we leave is, as the Prime Minister has said, he will invoke Article 50 of the Treaty of Rome. What that means is it tells the rest of the EU that we intend to leave. Then there's a 2-year period in which we negotiate the terms of our exit. And what I would imagine, this is all blue sky thinking, I don't have a crystal ball, but I want to answer the question as openly as I can. I think there would be probably 4 work streams. One would be looking at free movement rules, so what would be our immigration rules when we leave. Secondly, would be looking at what would be the trading arrangements with the EU when we leave, and that would also extend to the trading arrangements with those countries with whom the EU has trade agreements, which, by the way, the UK is also a party to, and my expectation is that that would continue under what's called a presumption of continuity, which Czechoslovakia used when they split into 2 countries. So that would be the second, Czech Republic and Slovakia. My point is Czechoslovakia became 2 countries. They used that presumption of continuity. I believe the UK could do that with free trade agreements that the EU has with the rest of the world. So that would be the second stream, is trade. The third stream would, I think, be intelligence sharing. So how are we going to work on those things that we want to continue to bilaterally, multilaterally cooperate on? And then the fourth stream will be the UK's free trade negotiations with the rest of the world. So what I would expect to see is by the time we leave, which would be probably, I'm guessing, by Christmas 2018, we'd actually be out of the EU. Then, as I say, we would have this £10 billion a year that would effectively be money that we would want to allocate, which is money that is instantly back to the UK. And it would be our intention to have resolved each of those issues in that work stream. And then you've seen other, you will have seen in the last few days, other proposals, for example, free trade agreements such as Switzerland has, such as Singapore has, much smaller economies than ours, with the likes of China, with the likes of India, and it would be absolutely the intention, if we left the EU, to negotiate those free trade agreements. And in fact, the European Commission's own numbers show that were we able to negotiate those free trade agreements, for the UK, that would give us, on day one, up to 300,000 new jobs. So actually, in my view, that would be incredibly positive on the economic side. Just on the markets and the uncertainty argument, I believe, again, with my years of experience, that there's an old saying, buy on the rumour, sell on the fact. Financial markets always experience volatility in the run-up to an event because they're positioning their books and that's how they make money. Once the event happens, they then close out those positions. They intend to make money, obviously, from the transaction, and then they carry on with a new reality. So all international commentators, when and if we vote leave, will on day one face a new reality. So all of the talk you've heard about, what we should do will change because every international statesman speaks in his or her own national interest. And so they will then be focused on how to make the best out of this new world order. And so I genuinely do not see the scope for the kind of systemic crisis that people are scaremongering about. I genuinely believe this is a massive equivalent of a supply-side reform. It is not a financial crisis. And I've lived through a huge number of financial crises. This just isn't one.
Thank you very much. Nick, what do you think is going to happen if we leave?
So the question I thought was, what's going to happen to the European Union?
Well,
that's the way it was phrased. I'm doing my homework. I was given a piece of paper.
What would
saying,
it look like if we left?
Yeah, what it would look like. European Union.
Think on your feet. Interpret the question as the way you want to interpret it.
Well, no, because so the reason I was intrigued by it is I think it's a new question. I haven't heard it in this referendum. We talked about what's going to happen to us. I thought the question was what's going to happen to Europe. And I think, broadly speaking, 3 things would happen, or are likely to happen. There's no certainty about the future course in the rest of the European Union if the United Kingdom were to vote to leave. I think, firstly, as night follows day, it would become a less economically small L liberal club, if you like it. We have been, really since our first entry into the European community and then the European Union, the leading advocates with the Dutch and the Germans and much of Scandinavia of what I'd broadly speaking call liberal economic thinking. Open trade. It was a Brit, I worked for him for a while, Leon Britton, a conservative who helped form the World Trade Organization, to openness to trade to the rest of the world, reforming painstakingly, not enough, but nonetheless trying to reform some of the legacies of the past, the common agricultural policy, the common fisheries policy, defeating, as I think has broadly happened, the sort of centralised bureaucratic dirigisme that used to be very much the kind of, particularly the French and French-led philosophy towards economic policy making. I think all of that would be significantly weakened, and that's precisely why the Germans and the Dutch and others, I think, are quite rightly very anxious about Britain leaving, because they feel that they would, the sort of the balance of argument within the European club, which has pretty comprehensively been won by liberal Anglo-Saxon economic thinking, would be more evenly balanced, if not shift slightly the other way. That's the first thing. I think the second thing, as one of the only 2 EU member states, the other one being France, with any meaningful military and diplomatic muscle to deploy around the world, I think as a sort of club it would just become significantly less effective in everything from international environmental talks, where our diplomatic skills have been very effective, through to European peacekeeping operations against piracy off the coast of Somalia, the whole, and including some of the now increasingly sophisticated paraphernalia of measures which have been taken to, at a European Union level and through our membership of the European Union, to deal with terrorism, extremism, and cross-border crime, from the European arrest warrant to Europol and so on. The third and perhaps most extreme possibility is the one, honestly, is interestingly, that some advocates of Brexit, like Nigel Farage and others, are quite open about, which is that if you listen to their argument, they say, we don't just want Britain. Okay, I know I'm not going to say that, but it's quite important, because I think he might be right. I think he says, I want Britain to leave, not just because I think it's right for Britain, but I think it'll unravel the rest of the European Union. And I think it might well have an unravelling effect on the rest of the European Union, because there's a great deal of populism around at the moment. If I was Viktor Orban, the sort of, the pro-Putin leader of Hungary, if I was the sort of nationalist government in Poland, if I was Marine Le Pen, if I was Geert Wilders, if I was the True Finns, if I was all this, there's a whole cast now of nationalist, chauvinist, angry, populist movements, many of which are increasingly either in or about to get into power. I would take the precedent of Britain leaving as a rallying call to say, well, we want to pull out of this as well. So it would have quite an unravelling effect, which, to be honest, again, whether you're for or against the European Union, is a very, very bad thing for Britain, whether we're in or we're about to depart or we're staying in the European Union. An unravelling European continent ain't good for Britain. Never was, by the way. For centuries, we avoided precisely that, from the wars of the Spanish Succession to the 7 Years' War to the major conflicts in the 20th century. We always were architects and co-authors of stability in Europe. We were not bystanders and outliers, which I think we would become in that scenario. So that's the scenario which I can't predict with certainty, but I think is perfectly possible.
Well, it's very interesting, because you've chosen to focus slightly differently in this question, which enables you to comment on each other's position, which is great. So, Andrea, what do you think would be the effect on the European Union of our departure, and do you care?
Yeah. First of all, as I said, I love Europe. I love Europeans. I speak fluent French. I particularly love the Germans. I've travelled widely around Europe. My parents lived in Portugal for a decade. I'm a huge fan of Europe, and I absolutely wish them well. But I actually don't agree that this could be the unravelling of the EU. And I think actually what Nick said is something that, just to reflect on for a moment, as Nick said, there is this rise of very nasty, the shining dawn in Greece, and the Marine Le Pen's outfit in France, even the Alternative for Deutschland, Deutschmark in Germany. These populist parties, as we like to call them, they are actually born of utter frustration. As I said in my opening remarks, the European Union, the Eurozone, has created 1 in 2 young people, not for 6 months, but for 6 years. And not just the youngest people, but all under 25s are not able to find work. So it's not the UK's referendum that's giving power to the elbow of these very worrying movements that are rising in Europe. It's the EU's failure to listen to the people. And this goes back to my point about why I did this reform work, because I genuinely believe the EU cannot go on as it does. It either has to get the democratic consent so that it can, as Nick says, make fiscal transfers, essentially from Germans who retire age 68 to Greeks who retire age 55. How is that going to happen? You know, I'm happy that we send fiscal transfers to Cornish fishermen, Welsh mining villages, the Highlands and Islands, because they're much worse off than us. But we're one united kingdom. We love each other. We're family. The Greeks and the Germans do not feel the same way. It's a fundamental problem that has no solution. So my view, actually, is that, number one, those in the euro cannot walk away. So it's a very big deal. You do not walk away from a currency, okay? That is not an option that's open to them. Number two, many of the EU countries are net beneficiaries. Actually, most of the Northern Europeans, we're the second biggest donor. There's about 8 North Europeans who are donors. The rest are all beneficiaries. So the scale is very different for them in terms of in or out. So I do not believe that our action would lead to it unravelling. What I do believe, and what I genuinely, with all my heart, wish for Europe, is that it's a wake-up call to the EU. And I was very comforted to hear Juncker, I think it was the other day, amazingly to me, saying the trouble is we have to recognise that these rise of these populist parties means that we cannot have a pure European Union. We cannot remove the will of the people. And I was thinking, well, that's something of a revelation to me.
I'm right on this, and I'll give you one last go at it before we bring it up in the room and go to the last section. But on this, and I think you actually, I can see the agreement, which is that you agree that if we were to leave, it would be a big shock to the European Union. You think that's a shock that could be benign in its impact.
Creative.
Nick,
no, not benign, creative.
Creative, and ultimately benign, presumably.
Yes,
and
yes.
Nick, you think its impact is likely to be destabilising and malign and to have a backwash in Britain. The one thing, just to give you 1 minute on this, Nick, in terms of the impact on us of Brexit, are you in the kind of it'll be instant Armageddon camp, or are you in the camp of we just don't really know? What's your kind of view on this?
Of course, there'll be a great deal of short-term volatility, but I mean, to be honest, this is such a huge, once-in-a-generation issue. You need to ask yourself what the longer-term effect is rather than the immediate. I mean, I think there will be a huge turbulence on the currency markets, the bond markets and so on, but look, I think over the longer term, firstly, I'm not sure whether the United Kingdom itself would persist. And there's no secret about this. Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond haven't been secretive about this. They said quite openly, if the United Kingdom were to vote to leave the European Union, the only way they could secure their ambition of keeping Scotland in the European Union is leaving the UK. So it's not just one union that is at stake, the European Union, it is our own union. And I cannot, for the life of me, understand why in this uncertain, footloose, fancy-free world, anyone thinks it's worth the risk of unravelling not just one supranational union, but our own broadly successful union of a family of nations of the United Kingdom. So that seems to me to be most likely. I also, I mean, unfashionably, so my personal view is that the consequences might actually be more discernibly felt over, let's say, a 10 or 15 year period rather than a 10 or 15 month period. Because I think it'll take some while, for instance, for Britain to feel the consequences of a leaching away of investment. And again, it's not I mean, all the investors, the major investors from banks to car manufacturers, again, have been perfectly open. They have said, we invest because of untrammeled access to European markets, which clearly we wouldn't have to the same degree if we were out of the single market. The Americans could not have been clearer, by the way, in private to me, in the 5 years that I was Deputy Prime Minister, very, very, very senior members of the White House would say, look, let's be blunt. The relevance of the United Kingdom to the United States in this special relationship is only there because you guys stand tall on your side of the Atlantic. If you can't hold your own in Berlin, Paris and Brussels, why on earth should we give you priority in our relationship? So I think all of those things are felt over time. Okay. So, and in fact, sort of have a cumulative effect. And my view is, fast forward 10, 15 years, no one's predictions, my crystal ball is no clearer than anybody else's. My sense is you'd feel that diminution of economic prosperity and international relevance quite sharply in 50 years' time compared to where we are now.
And no, because we've got to move on. I just want to ask you a very specific question, which is a point about Scotland, Andrea. Just in a single word, in terms of this possibility of Scotland leaving the UK after a leave vote, is it your contention, A, you don't think that would happen, or B, if it does happen, it's a price we would have to pay?
So I think that
A or B,
the whole... No, you've got to let me answer it. Sorry,
very
Matthew,
briefly.
you're trying to pin me to a word every time.
Okay, no, go on.
The point about Scotland is the same as the point about the United Kingdom, is the people speak and the government does as the people say. And unfortunately, that assertion about Scotland totally ignores that 2 years ago, 55% of Scots quite rightly decided once in a generation that they wanted to remain with the United Kingdom. Now, the Scottish nationalists, the clue is in the title of the party, exist to break up the union.
So you
but the people have spoken.
So you don't think...
And just because Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond didn't like the answer, the people spoke. The same is true with this referendum. The people will speak and the government will listen. And I'm sick and tired of hearing what Nicola Sturgeon wants. It's not up to her. It's up to the Scots. They decided.
Right. Good. That's clarified. Any questions? Yes.
I was an accountant in practice all my life. I would never sign a blank cheque. You were in financial services, and I'm sure you wouldn't sign a blank cheque. I've looked at the Remain campaign, and I've looked at the Exit campaign. I used to do prospectuses. There was a lot of guff in the front of a prospectus telling you how wonderful it's going to be, and you had to invest in it. And then there was a set of figures, and I used to do due diligence on those. I've seen the government and the Treasury and the International Monetary Fund. I've looked at all of those, and the prospectus for the Remain campaign is solid, verified and supported by due diligence.
Question.
The campaign for Exit has got no due diligence, no evidence, and it's fantasy land. And for me, I haven't seen evidence. If you can produce that evidence, I might listen.
OK, I'm going to assume that Andrew's answer to that is there is plenty of evidence. You just need to go to the right place and find it, because it wasn't really a question, it was a point. OK, we're going to go. I'm sorry, but we're running out of time. We're going to go to the final question. And the final question, where we're going to start with you, Nick, is, and if you can do this in a minute, because in a way you've hinted at it already, what do you think happens if we stay? You recognise the faults and the issues around the European Union. I think it's Andrea's assertion that if we stay, an ever closer union is inevitable. So tell us briefly what you think is the consequence of us deciding to stay in the European Union.
Well, if I have any criticism of the Remain campaign, is that it's been very effective at explaining why we shouldn't leave, but it's been less effective at saying what we should do if we remain. Because if you want to remain for a purpose. And I want us to remain to do what we have done throughout history, by the way, well before the European community was founded, which is lead. Not spectate, but lead. Lead in our own European neighbourhood. And I think there are plenty of areas where we can lead, but I would single out 3 areas. Firstly, economic leadership. The single market, for instance, we talk about it. Actually, the single market isn't even complete yet. It's nowhere near complete. For those who, we just heard from someone who's worked in accountancy, if you work in the Britain's mighty services industry, there's still far too many impediments to British lawyers, architects, advertisers and accountants selling their wares and services across the European single market. So we can complete the European single market, which was always the aspiration when it was first formed in the early 90s. I think we can do far more, particularly but not exclusively with the French, to enhance our collective security, from giving British expertise and advice on how to secure Britain's external borders in face of the huge influx of people, which, by the way, of course, will continue regardless whether we're in the European Union or not. And thirdly, I mean, it's one of my personal passions, but I think what was achieved in Paris in terms of the global environmental talks really should be regarded as a beginning rather than the end of a process. There's a huge amount we can do if Britain were to actually deploy its political and diplomatic muscle to continue to make the European Union a leader in facing this most global of all challenges, climate change. So I just think there's a rich, positive menu of things that we want to do, not only in our own interests, but also because we believe it makes a better world around us as well, that we can do more effectively by leading in the European Union. That's very much what I hope we would set about doing after the 24th. Not, which is slightly my fear, is sort of saying, if we win, sort of, phew, we haven't quit, what do we do now? I mean, the worst thing would be to sort of not quit and then not do anything. I mean, I don't regard not quitting as a sort of instruction of sort of stasis, of inaction. It's an active choice to stay, to do things which are right for us, right for Europe, right for the world.
And do you think, Nick, before I bring Andrea back on this, what are the prospects of that happening?
Well, I mean,
because you're asking people to say remain, and you're saying if we remain, then we can provide more leadership.
This is where it does, of course, slightly come down to domestic politics, I'm afraid, which is that it partly depends on whether there's the will and the political capital within the British government to deploy Britain's considerable economic, diplomatic and political muscle to lead. If instead the Conservative Party continues to devour itself on its own internal argument on this, there'll be no energy left, let alone in Europe, even at home, to do anything on behalf of the country. That's my fear at the moment, of course, is that it just becomes such a vortex just consumes all energy within Whitehall and Westminster. We basically don't have government at the moment. The government's completely paralysed. We haven't had government for the last 6 to 8 months. It's ludicrous. This last 2 budgets in a year. Unthinkable when I was... Anyway, sorry, but... Okay, I'm not... But you asked me, I'm giving you an honest answer. It's about political will, as so much it is in politics. If you want to do something, you've got to muster the political will. And for that, you have to have the kind of ability to do so within your political tribe. I hope, actually, for the sake of the country, I hope that will actually emerge on the 24th and people will bury the hatchet and get on with it, because the country's crying out for a government that actually does stuff rather than argue amongst itself.
So, Andrea, if we do vote to remain, you'll still have the Prime Minister that we elected last year. He'll be in charge. The Conservative Party will be running the country. What do you think will happen if we remain?
So I completely agree with Nick about what we should attempt to do. I absolutely agree. And I mean, more of this, quite honestly, is, these were all constructive suggestions we would continue, I'm sure, to try to influence. But what would actually happen? How successful would we be? I mean, we currently have 8% of the vote. When the numbers get redone in 2017, we'll have 12% of the vote. The renegotiation simply doesn't amount to much. We're introducing a national living wage, which will be a big pull, quite rightly, for all those young people whose lives have been trashed in Southern Europe and others besides. There is the expansion of the EU. There is the prospect for a European army. I'm not sure why everyone groans when that's discussed, because it's quite clearly the target of the Federica Mogherini, who is the commissioner for that. We will continue to have this problem with the lack of democratic legitimacy unless we can make inroads into that, which may therefore lead to other problems in Europe that we haven't yet foreseen. But of course, ultimately, the costs for the EU, it's massively overspent already. To go back to the 350 million a week, very briefly, that 350 million a week owed, 4.8 billion a year comes back as a rebate, roughly 5 billion a year comes back in subsidies, but those are all under the aegis of the European Union to make those decisions. And in 2020, those will be renegotiated. And of course, we are always renegotiated according to the performance of our economy. So as our economy performs better, so our share will get bigger. And with the problems in the European Union at the moment, our contributions will undoubtedly be bigger. The rebate only runs till 2020. If I may just quickly to that gentleman there, the accountant, I urge you, sir, because the problem is it's very easy to assert that the Remain has a clear idea and it's all nicely there on a ledger and the Leave doesn't. But the truth is that 80% of the world's economy is outside of the European Union. Most of the world, the 6.5 billion that aren't members of the European Union, trade either with free trade agreements or without them. The United States exports more to the EU than the UK does. Our trade with the EU has flatlined for 10 years. As Nick says, the single market for services literally doesn't work. Intra-EU trade is 80% manufacturing, 20% services, and most of that is financial services, where the UK is preeminent. In things like legal, professions, restaurateurs, e-commerce and so on, it simply doesn't work. So to say that there's no case for Leave, no economic case, is simply not true. Nobody has a crystal ball, and we've had a lot of accusations that, well, you're supposed to tell us what's going to happen. I would put it to you that if 28 of you, the number of EU member states, sat down and tried to discuss in English what you're going to have for dinner next Thursday, you'll struggle. If you try and do it in 28 different languages, you'll really struggle. And if you change the subject to how you're going to deal with the migration crisis, you will actually need an arbitrator like the European Commission to step in and tell you what to do, because there's no chance you can decide on your own. And that's the fundamental flaw
can we just,
with the European Union.
What I find fascinating about this part of the conversation is that Nick is saying, if we remain, the basis for remaining is that we should lead, but he recognises that there's not much evidence that we will. You're kind of saying, if we remain, we'll continue to be weak and feeble and pushed around, even though it'll actually be your government.
No. That's not what I'm saying
okay,
at all.
Why
I agreed with Nick that that's what we should do.
Why are you so pessimistic about?
We will succeed.
Given your patriotism,
yes,
and it's your government and your Prime Minister, Why are you so pessimistic about our capacity to be more influential, more powerful if we... I'm not putting you on the spot, I'm trying to get to the point.
You literally are putting me on the spot. I agree with Nick that we will attempt to lead. You know, in the last Parliament, you know, William Hague, as Foreign Secretary, did a huge amount to try and get British-born people into the Commission so that we actually had a seat at the table where the bright young things are sitting there coming up with ideas for new policies. Britain's contribution has massively fallen back. We need to totally soup that up if we remain in. I absolutely agree with that. We absolutely need to attempt to lead. What I'm saying is that the way that the EU is structured, that will not be possible. The Eurozone crisis overtakes everything, and what that doesn't overtake, the Schengen area, neither of which we're in, neither of which we have a voice in, other than big checks where the EU is moving money around between budgets, and that obviously includes our money, and that is going to continue. And unfortunately, this is why I did this reform work. It got nowhere. It's clear to me they don't have an appetite for reform. And so I say, as I said at the beginning, it either moves to a United States of Europe, which we're not a part of, or it fails, ultimately. And in the meantime, it is creating misery across the continent.
Okay, two really quick questions, and then I've got this impossible task, which I've got to try and summarise this for you, and so that you've then got a basis for making your decision, not as if you haven't already decided, all of you, mate. Yes, let's take the lady there. Brief, sharp question.
Most of the discussion focuses on what would be best for Britain, and parenthetically refers to what might be best for the world order, for international stability in a globalized world. I'd like to hear more about that.
I'm sure you would, and you're right. I kind of know what they're both going to say. Nick's going to say the world will be weaker. You're going to say the world will be stronger. So I take it as a good point you've raised. But right, and then finally these two questions, and then I'm going to summarise.
So, Andrea, I love your enthusiasm for reforming the EU, which you had a few years ago. Why have you given up so quickly on that reformation? After all, good reformations often take a long time in coming.
Okay, and then pass it on to that.
And in 100 years, what are we to fear from a United States of Europe when we all point to America, the USA, as a successful federal system?
Okay, you've got, because I'm going to summarise now, you've got one sentence to answer this point about why you've become so pessimistic about your capacity to make a difference. And Nick, United States of Europe in 100 years' time, what's wrong with that? Yeah.
So 3 years trying to identify what the reforms should be, spent a huge amount of time with the Prime Minister, travelling around Europe, talking to other politicians. There was appetite for reform then. The Prime Minister gave it his absolutely best shot with the certainty of a UK referendum on in or out behind him to lend weight to a serious renegotiation, and what came back was just beyond trivial. So for my money, then it is better that we, with our blessing, get out.
Nick, are you at all fazed by the idea that sitting here in 100 years' time, when the RSA will be 360 years old, we'll be part of the United States of Europe?
Well, the question is, what do we have to fear? And that's the interesting thing. I really don't fear... I don't feel fearful of what I think... I mean, here's the great irony, it's almost role reversal. I feel like I'm a sort of British bulldog on this stage, saying, we've shaped this thing, we've created this thing, we've been a sort of architect of this thing. It's so, you know, it's flawed, which undoubtedly is. Many of those flaws are of our own making. Why would we walk away from something which in many ways we've shaped and bent to our own will? I remember, a very quick little anecdote just to illustrate this. I remember the first day I ever walked into the European Parliament. I was an MEP, as you may know, between 1999 and 2004. And a veteran Belgian MEP, a lovely man called Willy de Klerk, I remember he had a great shock of white hair and we used to wear bow ties. And he came up to me and he said, the problem with the European community is it's too British. I thought, oh God, what's he going to go on about now? He said, if you were a political scientist from Mars who landed on Europe now, you would say that two of the greatest achievements in European integration in recent years was first the creation of the single market, imposed on the rest of us by Lord Cockfield, Margaret Thatcher, all the rest of it, imposing your sort of perfidious Anglo-Saxon economic liberalism, and secondly, and very dramatically, the astonishing enlargement of the European community as it was then to the countries of Central Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, driven aggressively by the British government at the time, precisely, by the way, to stop the Franco-German hegemony or duopoly imposing things on us. We have triumphed. We've stayed out of the single currency. We've stayed out of Schengen. So that I'm not fearful, because time and time again, we get what we want. What is there to be frightened about?
Very good. Okay. So there's a bit in Fawlty Towers where Basil Fawlty says, meet my wife, specialist subject, the bleeding obvious. Now, I am now going to be Mrs. Faulty and try the bleeding obvious. So it seems to me that on the issue of what the European Union has done for us, Andrea's view is that what we got into was a conversation about sharing power. And I think, Andrea, your view is that, yes, you have to share power on a case-by-case basis in relation to treaties, but you don't need the broader sharing of sovereignty which is implicit in the European Union and which you inevitably think will inevitably lead to a superstate or even more of a superstate. Nick, your view is that cooperation is necessary in the face of globalisation, accelerating globalisation, and if anything, we probably need to share more sovereignty in the best interests of the UK and of the world. When it comes to what happens if we leave, you both think there will be a big shock to the European Union. Andrea, you in essence think that will be a good shock, forcing the European Union to confront the level of dissatisfaction with it, the things that aren't working about it. Nick, you fear that it would be a bad shock. It would lead to the fragmentation of the European Union, and that would be a bad thing for the United Kingdom. In relation to the UK, actually, both of you don't necessarily, Nick, you don't necessarily think there'll be an immediate crisis, there may be some volatility. You're more focused on the long term. Andrea, you think in the long term we will adjust and we will end up in a stronger position. Nick, you think we will adjust, we will end up in a weaker position, particularly in relation to trade and power. And then finally, if we stay, Nick, you think if we stay, we have to lead, and we can lead in strengthening the European Union in relation to areas like trade and environment and other issues. Andrea, you agree that if we do stay, we should lead, but you believe that the structural nature of the European Union means that however determined we are, we will not be able to achieve the changes which we need to make and which you have advocated in your pamphlet that you've referred to a couple of times. So, can I ask you, we've got 1 minute to go, is that a reasonable summary of the position, Nick?
Pretty good.
Thank you. Andrea, are you happy?
Yeah, happy.
Very good. I get a round of applause now.